December 7th, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Hans Mueller stared at his dinner tray in disbelief. Real butter, white bread, coffee that actually tasted like coffee. As a German prisoner of war, he was eating better than his own family back home had in 2 years. But that wasn't the part that broke him. Earlier that morning, he'd watched his 200 American bomber formation fly overhead. 200 planes in one morning. His entire Luftwaffe squadron had celebrated building their 100th fighter over 6 months. The math was starting to make a terrifying kind of sense. When the camp guards casually mentioned that America was producing one B-24 Liberator every single hour, Hans thought they were lying. When they showed him the factory footage, his world collapsed. While Germany had built 40,000 aircraft during the entire war, America had already churned out over 300,000 fighters, and they were just getting started. Hans realized something that would haunt him forever. Germany hadn't just lost the war, they'd never even been in the same fight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 15th, 1943, Munich, Germany. The cold morning air bit at Hans Mueller's face as he walked through the factory gates. Snow crunched under his worn leather boots. The smell of coal smoke and machine oil filled his nose. It was the same smell he had breathed every morning for 3 years. The same smell that meant work, duty, and the promise that Germany would win this war. Hans was 28 years old and proud of his job. He was a supervisor at the Messerschmitt aircraft factory. Every day, he watched workers build the fastest fighter planes in the world. The Bf-109 was a beautiful machine. Sleek silver metal, sharp wings that cut through the air like knives. German engineering at its finest. The factory floor was loud with the sound of hammers and riveting guns. Men in grey coveralls bent over metal frames. Sparks flew from welding torches. The air tasted of hot metal and sweat. Hans loved this place. It felt like the beating heart of the German war effort. "Good morning, Herr Mueller," called out Fritz, one of the older workers. His hands were black with grease. His face was thin from the war rations, but his eyes still held pride. "Today we finish number 100. Hans smiled. Their 100th Bf-109 fighter. It had taken them 6 months to reach this number, but it was a good number, a proud number. Hans walked over to look at the plane. The morning light from the factory windows made the metal shine. The black cross on the wing looked sharp and clean. This plane would fly fast and strike hard at Germany's enemies. "Beautiful work, Fritz," Hans said. He ran his hand along the wing. The metal was smooth and perfect. German workers were the best in the world. German planes were the fastest. German pilots were the bravest. Everyone knew these things were true. At noon, the factory whistle blew. Hans walked to the small office where he ate his lunch. His wife Greta had packed him the usual meal: a piece of dark bread, a thin slice of ersatz cheese made from sawdust and chemicals, a thermos of coffee that tasted more like bitter water than real coffee. But it was enough. Everyone in Germany was making sacrifices for the war effort. Through his office window, Hans could see workers celebrating around plane number 100. The factory manager, Herr Richter, had announced that everyone would get an extra slice of bread with their evening meal. Such good news is rare these days. Food was getting harder to find. Real coffee had disappeared months ago. Even the bread was getting thinner and darker. Hans thought about his wife Greta waiting for him at home. She had grown thinner too. Her dresses hung loose on her small frame. But she never complained. She sewed uniforms for soldiers and grew turnips in their tiny garden. She was strong, like all German women, strong and patient and willing to wait for victory. The afternoon brought troubling news. Herr Richter called Hans into his office. The older man's face looked grey and tired. His desk was covered with papers and reports. The air smelled of cigarettes and worry. "Hans, I have received some reports," Herr Richter said quietly. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "The British bombed 3 of our aircraft factories last week. 3 factories, Hans. Gone." Hans felt something cold move in his stomach. 3 factories meant hundreds of planes that would never be built. It meant hundreds of workers with no jobs. It meant Germany falling further behind. "But sir, we are still building the best fighters in the world," Hans said. "Our pilots say the Bf-109 can beat any Allied plane." Herr Richter nodded, but his eyes looked sad. "Yes, Hans, our planes are excellent, but the reports I am reading say strange things. They say the Americans are building planes faster than we can count them. The numbers seem impossible." "Impossible how, sir?" "The intelligence reports claim the Americans built 10,000 aircraft last month alone. 10,000, Hans. We built 800. These numbers cannot be true. They must be enemy lies." Hans agreed. Such numbers made no sense. America was soft. Americans liked comfort and ease. They could not work as hard as Germans. They could not sacrifice like Germans. Everyone knew Americans were weak and lazy. That evening, Hans walked home through streets that were darker than they used to be. The streetlights had been turned off to save electricity. Windows were covered with black paper to hide light from enemy bombers. The city felt quiet and empty. Too many young men were away fighting. Too many buildings had been damaged by bombs. His home was a small apartment above a bakery. The bakery had been closed for months because there was no flour. Hans climbed the narrow stairs and opened the door to find Greta sewing by candlelight. Real candles were hard to find now. She was using thin candles made from animal fat. They smoked and smelled bad, but they gave enough light to work. At noon, Hans loved this place. It felt like the beating heart of the German war effort. "Good morning, Herr Müller," called out Fritz, one of the older workers. His hands were black with grease. His face was thin from the war rations, but his eyes still held pride. "Today we finish number 100. Hans smiled. Their 100th Bf-109 fighter. It had taken them 6 months to reach this number, but it was a good number, a proud number. Hans walked over to look at the plane. The morning light from the factory windows made the metal shine. The black cross on the wing looked sharp and clean. This plane would fly fast and strike hard at Germany's enemies. "Beautiful work, Fritz," Hans said. He ran his hand along the wing. The metal was smooth and perfect. German workers were the best in the world. German planes were the fastest. German pilots were the bravest. Everyone knew these things were true. At noon, the factory whistle blew. Hans walked to the small office where he ate his lunch. His wife Greta had packed him the usual meal: a piece of dark bread, a thin slice of ersatz cheese made from sawdust and chemicals, a thermos of coffee that tasted more like bitter water than real coffee. But it was enough. Everyone in Germany was making sacrifices for the war effort. Through his office window, Hans could see workers celebrating around plane number 100. The factory manager, Herr Richter, had announced that everyone would get an extra slice of bread with their evening meal. Such good news is rare these days. Food was getting harder to find. Real coffee had disappeared months ago. Even the bread was getting thinner and darker. Hans thought about his wife Greta waiting for him at home. She had grown thinner too. Her dresses hung loose on her small frame. But she never complained. She sewed uniforms for soldiers and grew turnips in their tiny garden. She was strong, like all German women. Strong and patient and willing to wait for victory. 3 weeks later, Hans received orders that changed everything. He was called up to active duty as a Luftwaffe reserve pilot. His factory experience made him valuable for special missions. Hans felt proud and nervous. He had trained as a pilot before the war, but he had spent most of his time building planes, not flying them. On January 8, 1944, Hans climbed into the cockpit of a Bf-109 for his first combat mission. The plane smelled of fuel and oil and leather. The engine roared to life with a sound like thunder. The propeller spun so fast it disappeared. Hans felt the power of German engineering under his hands. His squadron's mission was to attack Allied bombers over France. As they flew west, Hans looked down at the countryside below. Everything looked small and neat from the air. Farm fields made perfect squares. Rivers wound like silver ribbons. It was beautiful and peaceful. Then he saw something that made his blood turn cold. Below them, stretching as far as he could see, was a convoy of Allied vehicles. Trucks, tanks, jeeps, and equipment carriers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were all moving east towards Germany, and they all looked new, brand new. Hans had never seen so many vehicles in one place. The convoy looked like a metal river flowing across the land. Each truck was painted in fresh colors. Each tank had clean, sharp edges. There were no dents or rust or patches. These vehicles had just come from factories, many factories. Factories that could build faster than Hans had ever imagined. The radio in his cockpit crackled to life. "Enemy fighters approaching from the west," the voice said. "Prepare for combat." Hans looked up and saw them. American P-51 Mustangs, dozens of them, flying in perfect formation. Their silver wings caught the winter sunlight. They looked fast and deadly and confident. The air battle lasted only minutes. Hans fired his guns and tried to stay alive. Around him, German fighters fell from the sky like burning leaves. The Americans seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited planes. When Hans's engine was hit by enemy fire, he had no choice but to bail out. As his parachute carried him toward the French countryside, he watched American fighters circle overhead like hunting wolves. They could have shot him while he hung helpless in the air, but they didn't. They let him fall safely to earth. Hans landed hard in a muddy field. His right leg was injured and blood ran down his face. As he struggled to stand, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. American voices calling to each other, boots running through mud. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When the American soldiers found him, Hans expected to be shot. Instead, they gave him water and bandaged his wounds. They spoke to him in broken German, trying to comfort him. Their uniforms were clean and well made. Their equipment looked expensive and new. As they loaded him into their jeep, Hans looked back at the sky. More American planes were flying overhead, wave after wave of bombers and fighters. The sky seemed full of them. Hans tried to count them, but gave up after 50. There were too many to count. Sitting in that American jeep with a bandage around his head, Hans began to understand something terrible. The reports about American aircraft production might not have been lies after all. March 12, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The American truck bumped and rattled as it carried Hans deeper into the heart of America. Through the canvas cover, he could see endless fields of wheat and corn. The land looked rich and green. Fat cattle grazed in pastures that stretched to the horizon. Hans had never seen so much food growing in one place. In Germany, every patch of dirt was used to grow turnips and potatoes. Here, the Americans seemed to have more land than they knew what to do with. The truck stopped at a gate with tall wire fences. A sign read, "Camp Concordia, Prisoner of War Facility." American guards checked papers and waved them through. Hans felt his stomach twist with fear and hunger. He had not eaten real food in 2 days. The Americans had given him water and some crackers, but nothing more. The camp was bigger than Hans expected. Long wooden buildings stretched in neat rows. Hundreds of German prisoners walked around in the yard. They looked healthy and clean. Some were playing soccer, others were reading books. Hans was confused. These men did not look like they were suffering. An American sergeant led Hans to a building marked Processing Center. The man was tall and thick, with red hair and freckles. His uniform was clean and pressed. His boots were shiny black leather. Everything about him looked expensive and well-made. "Welcome to Kansas, Fritz," the sergeant said in broken German. His voice was not mean or angry, it sounded almost friendly. "Are you hungry?" Hans nodded. He was always hungry now. Everyone in Germany was always hungry. The sergeant led him to a room with tables and benches. The smell that hit Hans made his knees weak. Real food, cooking meat, fresh bread. His mouth filled with water and his stomach cramped with need. Sitting down, the sergeant said, he disappeared through a door and came back with a metal tray. Hans looked at the tray and could not believe his eyes. There was a thick slice of white bread with real butter melting on top. A bowl of soup that had pieces of real meat floating in it. A cup of coffee that smelled like actual coffee beans. A piece of cake with white frosting. Hans stared at the food and felt tears come to his eyes. "Is this a special day?" Hans asked in English. "A holiday?" "No, Fritz," the sergeant said in broken German. "This is just regular chow. You get 3 meals like this every day." Hans ate slowly, trying to make the food last. The bread was soft and sweet. The butter was rich and creamy. The soup was thick with vegetables and chunks of beef. The coffee was hot and bitter and perfect. Hans had not tasted food this good since before the war started. His family in Germany had not eaten this well in 3 years. When he finished eating, another guard took Hans to his barracks. The building was warm and dry. Each prisoner had his own bed with clean sheets and a wool blanket. There were windows that let in sunlight. The floor was swept clean. Hans had lived in worse places when he was free. That night, Hans lay on his bed and listened to the other prisoners talking quietly in German. They were discussing things that made no sense to him. "Did you see the kitchen today?" one man whispered. "They have machines that wash 1,000 plates in an hour. Everything is electric. Everything is automatic." "The guards told me they throw away leftover food every day," another prisoner said. "Throw it away? Enough food to feed a German family for a week, and they put it in the garbage." "My work detail went to the train station yesterday," said a third voice. "I counted 40 freight cars full of new tanks, all painted and ready for battle. 40 cars on just one train." Hans closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the voices continued. "The Americans have a machine that makes ice," someone said. "Ice in the middle of summer? They put it in their drinks just to make them cold." "The camp commander drives a different car every day. He has 3 cars, 3, and he says this is normal for American officers." Hans pulled his blanket over his head, but he could still hear the whispers. Stories that sounded impossible. Stories about abundance that hurt to think about. The next morning, Hans was assigned to work detail at a nearby wheat farm. An American guard named Joe drove him and 5 other prisoners in a truck that was newer and cleaner than any vehicle Hans had seen in Germany. The seats were soft leather. The radio played music. Joe offered the prisoners chewing gum and cigarettes. The farm was owned by a man named Bill Watson. He was about 50 years old, with gray hair and kind eyes. He spoke a little German and seemed genuinely happy to have help with his work. Hans expected to be treated like a slave. Instead, Bill treated the prisoners like hired workers. At lunchtime, Bill's wife brought food to the fields. Thick sandwiches with real ham and cheese. Cold milk in glass bottles. Fresh cookies still warm from the oven. Hans ate until his stomach hurt. Mrs. Watson smiled and gave him 2 extra cookies to save for later. "You boys are working hard," she said in simple English. "You deserve good food." After lunch, Hans helped Bill repair a fence. As they worked, Bill talked about his family. His son was fighting in the Pacific. His daughter lived in Chicago and worked in a factory that made airplane parts. His other son was away at college. "College?" Hans asked. "During the war?" "Sure," Bill said. "The war won't last forever. Boys need education." As they walked back toward the barn, Hans noticed something strange in the distance. 3 vehicles were parked behind the farmhouse. A truck, a car, and a tractor. All of them looked new and well-maintained. "Are all those yours?" Hans asked. Bill nodded. "The truck for hauling grain, the car for going to town, the tractor for planting. We don't drive much now because of gas rationing, but we get by." Gas rationing? In Germany, there was no gas at all for civilians. Bill had more fuel sitting unused in his barn than most German cities saw in a month. That evening, as the prisoners rode back to camp, Hans saw something that made him forget to breathe. A convoy of trucks was passing on the highway. Hans started counting. 10 trucks, 20, 30. He kept counting until he reached 100, then stopped. The convoy stretched beyond the horizon. Every truck was loaded with supplies, food, ammunition, equipment, machines. Everything was new and clean and perfectly organized. "How many trucks do Americans have?" asked Joe. Joe shrugged. "I don't know. Thousands, I guess. The factories keep making them faster than we can count." That night, Hans started keeping a secret diary. He wrote on scraps of paper and hid them under his mattress. He had to record what he was seeing. Someone in Germany needed to know the truth about America. "Day 3 in camp," he wrote. "The Americans feed us better than German officers eat. The guards are not cruel. They seem almost apologetic about keeping us prisoner. Today, I saw more vehicles in one convoy than exist in my entire hometown." The next week brought new revelations that shook Hans to his core. He was assigned to clean windows in the camp administration building. Through one office window, he could see an airfield in the distance. American planes were landing and taking off all day long. Hans began counting. In 1 hour, he saw 27 bombers land. All of them looked factory fresh, silver paint gleaming in the sun. No damage or repairs. These were not battle-worn aircraft limping home. These were new planes on their way to war. A camp guard noticed Hans staring at the planes. "Pretty impressive, huh, Fritz?" the guard said. "That's just one base. We got hundreds of bases like this all over the country." "Hundreds?" Hans whispered. "Sure. We're building planes so fast we can't find enough pilots to fly them all." Hans felt dizzy. In Germany, they celebrated building 100 planes in 6 months. The Americans were building 27 new bombers every hour at just one base. The mathematics was impossible to understand. On Friday afternoon, something happened that broke Hans's understanding of reality completely. A truck pulled up to the camp gate. The driver got out and began unloading cases of bottles. Cold bottles covered with drops of water. The guard who was helping him called out to the other guards, "Coca-Cola delivery!" Hans watched in amazement as the guards opened the cold bottles and drank the dark liquid. They were laughing and joking like children. Ice-cold soda delivered to a prisoner camp in the middle of Kansas. Sugar and caffeine are treated like everyday pleasures. The truck driver noticed Hans staring. "Wanna try one, soldier?" he asked in friendly English. Hans nodded, not trusting his voice. The man handed him a cold bottle. Hans had never tasted anything like it. Sweet and fizzy and refreshing. In Germany, sugar was more precious than gold. Here, Americans were giving it away to prisoners. "We deliver to this camp every week," the driver said. "The boys work hard guarding you fellows. They deserve a cold drink." Every week. Hans wrote in his diary that night, "The Americans give their guards luxuries that German generals cannot obtain. They deliver ice-cold sugar water to prison camps like it means nothing. How can we be winning this war when our enemies treat prison guards better than we treat our own officers?" Hans began to notice details that painted a picture he did not want to see. The guards' uniforms were made from fine wool. Their boots were real leather, not cardboard and glue like German boots. They carried automatic rifles that looked expensive and precise. Everything about the American military spoke of unlimited resources. One evening, Hans overheard two guards talking about their families back home. One guard was complaining that his wife had to wait in line to buy meat. Not because there was no meat, but because she wanted a specific cut of beef. The other guard laughed and said his family ate steak twice a week, even with rationing. Steak twice a week, with rationing. Hans had not seen real beef in 2 years. As spring turned to summer, Hans's worldview began to crack like ice in warm water. Every day brought new evidence that America possessed resources beyond his ability to comprehend. The prison camp received deliveries of food that could have fed his hometown. The guards drove vehicles that were newer than any car Hans had seen in peacetime Germany. But the moment that shattered his beliefs completely came on a hot afternoon in June. Hans was working in the camp vegetable garden when he heard the sound of airplane engines. He looked up and saw a formation of American bombers flying overhead. He started counting automatically, the way he always did. 10, 20, 50, 100. The formation kept coming. Hans kept counting until his neck hurt from looking up. When the last plane disappeared, he had counted over 200 bombers in a single formation. 200 planes, flying together like a flock of deadly birds. Hans sat down in the dirt and put his head in his hands. In that moment, he understood that everything he had believed about the war was wrong. That night, he wrote in his diary with shaking hands, "Today, I saw America's true power, not in their kindness to prisoners or their abundance of food. I saw it in 200 bombers flying overhead like it meant nothing. Germany has perhaps 50 bombers left in the entire Luftwaffe. America sent 200 over my head in one afternoon, and they were probably just a training flight." The question that haunted Hans as he lay in his comfortable bed with his full stomach was becoming impossible to ignore. If America could build planes and trucks and weapons in numbers that seemed unlimited, if they could feed their prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers, if they could deliver ice-cold luxuries to prison camps in the middle of nowhere, Then what does that say about Germany's chances of winning this war? The answer was starting to terrify him. November 23, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Hans woke to the smell of roasting turkey. The rich, deep aroma filled the entire barracks and made his stomach rumble with hunger he had almost forgotten was possible. Outside his window, the Kansas sky was gray with winter clouds, but inside the camp, something special was happening. "Thanksgiving," said Werner, the prisoner in the next bunk. "The Americans are making a feast for us. A feast, Hans, as if we were their honored guests instead of their enemies." Hans pulled on his camp-issued clothes and walked to the mess hall. The building was decorated with colorful paper and autumn leaves. American guards were setting long tables with white cloth and real silverware. The prisoners stood in groups, whispering to each other in amazement. The camp chaplain, a tall man with gentle eyes named Father McKenna, stood at the front of the room. He spoke in careful German that he had been practicing for weeks. "Today is Thanksgiving," he said. "It is the day when American families gather to give thanks for their blessings. We want to share this tradition with you. Today, you will eat the same meal that millions of American families are eating in their homes." Hans felt something cold move through his chest. The same meal that American families ate in their homes while their sons and husbands were fighting a war across the ocean? The first course arrived on metal trays carried by smiling guards. Each prisoner received a bowl of soup that was thick with vegetables and chunks of chicken. Real chicken, not the watery broth with turnip scraps that Hans remembered from home. The soup was hot and creamy and tasted like comfort itself. But this was only the beginning. The main course came in portions that made Hans's eyes water. A thick slice of roasted turkey, golden brown and dripping with juice. Mashed potatoes with real butter melting into yellow pools. Sweet potatoes covered with something that looked like burned sugar but tasted like heaven. Green beans that were actually green, not the gray mush that passed for vegetables in Germany. Hans cut a piece of turkey and put it in his mouth. The meat was tender and seasoned with herbs he could not name. Juice ran down his chin. He had to close his eyes to keep from crying. This was how food was supposed to taste. This was what his body had been craving for years without knowing it. "Is this really what American families eat?" Hans asked Father McKenna in broken English. "Every Thursday in November," the chaplain replied, "and many families eat like this every Sunday too. It is our tradition." Every Sunday. Hans wrote those words in his mind like a prayer and a curse. American families ate like this every week, while German families fought over moldy bread. The meal continued with cranberry sauce that was sweet and tart, rolls that were soft and warm, and vegetables that had been cooked with care and seasoning. Hans ate slowly, trying to make each bite last forever. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, some with tears running down their faces. But the final course broke something inside Hans that could never be repaired. The guards brought out pies. Real pies with thick crusts and sweet fillings. Pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream. Apple pie with cinnamon and sugar. Cherry pie with juice that stained the white plates red like blood. Hans took a bite of pumpkin pie and felt his understanding of the world collapse like a house made of cards. The pie was sweet beyond imagination. The cream was rich and thick. The crust was buttery and perfect. This was not survival food. This was not rationed food. This was celebration food, and the Americans were serving it to their prisoners? "My wife has not tasted sugar in 18 months, Hans whispered to Werner. "My mother dreams about real butter. And these people serve pie to their enemies? After the meal, Father McKenna gathered the prisoners in the recreation hall. He had set up a movie projector and a white screen. "I want to show you something," he said, "something that will help you understand America." The lights went out and the projector began to hum. On the screen appeared black and white images of American factories. But these were not the small workshops Hans knew from Germany. These were buildings that stretched as far as the camera could see. Massive halls filled with machines and workers and endless assembly lines. "This is the Willow Run plant in Michigan," Father McKenna explained. "Here, the Ford Motor Company builds B-24 Liberator bombers." Hans watched in stunned silence as the camera showed workers assembling airplane parts with mechanical precision. Hundreds of workers moved like dancers in a carefully planned performance. Wings, engines, and fuselages came together in a rhythm that never stopped. "This factory produces one completed bomber every hour," the chaplain said quietly. 24 bombers every day, 7 days a week. One bomber every hour. Hans did the mathematics in his head. In one day, this one factory built more bombers than his entire aircraft plant had built in 6 months. In 1 week, they built more planes than Germany built in a year. The film continued, showing other factories. Boeing plants in Seattle, where workers assembled flying fortresses. Consolidated plants where liberators took shape on assembly lines that moved like rivers of steel. Republic factories where Thunderbolt fighters rolled off production lines like automobiles. The United States currently operates over 200 aircraft manufacturing facilities, Father McKenna explained. They employ more than 2 million workers. Last month alone, American factories completed over 15,000 military aircraft. 15,000 aircraft in 1 month. Hans felt dizzy. Germany had built perhaps 40,000 aircraft during the entire war. America had built 15,000 in 30 days. But the film that destroyed Hans completely showed the River Rouge complex in Detroit. The camera flew over a factory that looked like a small city. Smokestacks reached toward the sky like the fingers of giants. Railroad tracks stretched in every direction, carrying raw materials in and finished tanks out. "This facility can produce a Sherman tank every 10 minutes, the chaplain replied. "They operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workers live in company housing and shop in company stores. Their children attend company schools. Everything they need is provided." A tank every 10 minutes. Hans tried to imagine the German tank factories he had visited. Small buildings where workers struggled to build 1 tank per week with materials that were often damaged or incomplete. The Americans were building tanks faster than Germany could build motorcycles. The final film showed something that made Hans understand the true scope of American power. Aerial footage of American naval shipyards. Dozens of aircraft carriers under construction at the same time. Liberty ships being launched every few days. Destroyers and cruisers taking shape in dry docks that stretched beyond the horizon. The United States launched over 1,900 ships last year, Father McKenna said, more tonnage than the rest of the world combined. When the lights came back on, Hans sat in his chair and stared at the blank screen. Around him, other prisoners whispered in German. Some were crying, others sat in shocked silence. All of them were trying to understand what they had just seen. "Why are you showing us this?" Hans asked in English. Father McKenna sat down beside him. "Because you need to understand the truth," he said gently. "Your leaders told you that America was weak and divided. They said we were soft and couldn't fight. But you have seen our abundance. You have tasted our food. Now you have witnessed our industrial power. What do you think?"
Hans opened his mouth to defend Germany, to recite the propaganda he had believed for so long. But the words would not come. How could he argue with what he had seen with his own eyes? How could he deny the evidence of American strength when it surrounded him every day?
That night, Hans sat in his bunk and wrote in his diary with a pencil that shook in his hand. The words came slowly, painfully, like confessing sins to a priest. Today I learned the truth about this war. We are not fighting against a weak enemy who got lucky. We are fighting against a nation that can build more war machines in 1 month than we can build in 1 year. They feed their prisoners better than we feed our soldiers. They give their enemies luxuries that our generals cannot obtain. Hans stopped writing and stared at the paper. The next words were the hardest he had ever written. We told ourselves that American democracy made them weak. We said their love of comfort made them soft. But I have lived among them for 8 months now. I have seen their kindness and their abundance and their incredible power to build and create. They are not weak. They are not soft. They are the strongest nation on earth, and we have made them our enemies. The pencil broke in his fingers. Hans threw the pieces across the room and buried his face in his hands. Everything he had believed was a lie. Every speech about German superiority was propaganda. Every promise of victory was fantasy. The Americans had not defeated Germany through luck or numbers alone. They had defeated Germany because they possessed something that Hans was only beginning to understand. They had the power to create abundance instead of scarcity. They could build instead of just destroy. They could feed their enemies while fighting a war on 2 sides of the world. Hans lay down on his comfortable bed with his full stomach and his warm blanket. Outside, Kansas snow was beginning to fall. Somewhere across the ocean, his wife Greta was probably eating turnip soup by candlelight, still believing that Germany would win this war. But Hans knew better now. He had tasted American strength, and it was sweet like pumpkin pie and powerful like factory smoke. The war was not just lost. It had been lost before it began, because Germany had never understood what they were fighting against. In the darkness of his barracks, Hans whispered a prayer in German. Not for German victory, because that was impossible now. Not for his own survival, because the Americans had already shown him more mercy than he deserved. He prayed for wisdom to understand what he had learned, and courage to carry that truth back to Germany when this war finally ended. The boy who had built fighter planes with pride was gone forever. In his place lay a man who had discovered that real strength was not about building weapons of war. Real strength was about building a nation so abundant that it could afford to be generous to its enemies. July 15, 1946, Munich Central Station, Germany. The train wheels screeched against rusted tracks as Hans pressed his face to the dirty window. 2 years in American captivity had not prepared him for what he saw outside. Munich looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. Buildings stood in broken rows, their walls black with soot and riddled with holes from Allied bombs. Rubble filled the streets like gray snow that never melted. Hans clutched a canvas bag in his lap. Inside were gifts from his American guards: a bar of chocolate wrapped in silver paper, a small bag of real coffee beans, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. These simple items were worth more than gold in Germany, but they felt heavy in his hands, like evidence of crimes he could not name. The train station was a skeleton of twisted metal and broken glass. Refugees moved through the ruins like ghosts.
their clothes hanging in rags, their faces hollow with hunger. Children with stick-thin arms begged for scraps of food. Old women picked through garbage, searching for anything useful. Hans stepped off the train and felt the broken glass crunch under his feet. The air smelled of smoke and decay and human waste. This was his homeland. This was the Germany he had fought to defend. This was what was left after believing in lies. A Red Cross worker approached him with a clipboard. She was young, but her face looked old and tired. Her uniform was patched in several places. "Name," she asked in German. "Hans Müller, returning prisoner from America." She made a mark on her paper. "Do you have family in Munich?" "My wife, Greta Müller. She lived on Hauptstrasse before the war." The woman's face softened with pity. Hauptstrasse was bombed in 1943. Most families moved to the refugee camps outside the city. Check with the Displaced Persons Office. Hans walked through streets he no longer recognized. Buildings where he had shopped and worked were now piles of broken stone. The bakery below his old apartment was a crater filled with stagnant water. The factory where he had built fighter planes was a field of twisted metal and weeds. He found the Displaced Persons Office in a basement that smelled of dampness and unwashed bodies. Hundreds of names were written on boards that covered the walls. Hans searched until he found Müller, Greta, written in faded pencil. Next to her name was an address in Camp 7, 15 kilometers outside Munich. The truck that took Hans to Camp 7 was older than any vehicle he had seen in America. It burned wood instead of gasoline and moved slowly, belching black smoke. The driver was missing his left arm and spoke in short sentences about how difficult everything had become. Camp 7 was a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by a fence. It looked like the prisoner camp in Kansas, but without the care or comfort. The buildings were gray and weathered. The windows were covered with cardboard instead of glass. Thin smoke rose from chimneys, but Hans could tell there was not much fuel for heating. He found Greta in Barracks 12. When she opened the door, Hans almost did not recognize her. His wife had become a skeleton wrapped in loose skin. Her dress was made from old curtains sewn together. Her shoes were wooden blocks tied to her feet with rope. But her eyes were still bright, and when she saw him, she smiled with joy that broke his heart. "Hans," she cried, throwing her arms around him. She held her gently, afraid she might break. She weighed no more than a child. Through her thin dress, she could feel every rib, every bone. "Greta, my love, I am home." That evening, they sat together in her small corner of the barracks. Greta had prepared a meal from her weekly rations, a thin soup made from potato peels and grass, a slice of black bread that was more sawdust than grain, a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt acorns. Hans looked at the meal and remembered Thanksgiving dinner in Kansas, turkey and potatoes and pie with whipped cream. He remembered the abundance that Americans took for granted while his wife had been starving in a refugee camp. "How did you survive?" Hans asked quietly. Greta smiled and took his hand. "I told myself you would come back. I saved part of my bread every day, hoping to share it with you when you returned." She reached under her thin mattress and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside were crumbs of moldy bread, carefully saved for months. Hans stared at the breadcrumbs and felt tears run down his face. His wife had been starving herself to save food for him, while his American captors had fed him 3 meals a day and worried about his comfort. "Tell me about America," Greta said. "Was it terrible? Did they hurt you?" Hans opened his canvas bag and pulled out the chocolate bar. Greta gasped when she saw the silver wrapper. "Real chocolate," Hans said. "The guards gave it to me when I left." Greta held the chocolate like it was made of diamonds.
The guards gave this to you? Why? They said I was a good worker. They wished me luck in Germany. Hans broke off a small piece of chocolate and gave it to his wife. She put it in her mouth and closed her eyes. I had forgotten, she whispered. I had forgotten that food could taste like this. That night, Hans lay beside his wife on a mattress stuffed with straw and tried to understand what had happened to his country. Through the thin walls, he could hear other families talking quietly. Stories of sons who died in Russia, daughters who disappeared during the bombing of Berlin, fathers who never came home from the war. Everyone was hungry, everyone was cold, everyone was defeated. But the hardest part for Hans was knowing the truth about why they had lost. These people still believed that Germany had fought bravely against overwhelming odds. They thought they had lost because of bad luck or betrayal. They did not know that America had been building 300 planes for every one that Germany built. They did not know that American prisoners ate better than German generals. In the days that followed, Hans tried to find work in the ruins of Munich. The American occupation forces were hiring Germans to help rebuild the city. When Hans applied for a job, the American officer looked at his prisoner of war papers. "You were at Camp Concordia?" the officer asked in English. "Good camp, good people there." "Yes, sir," Hans replied. "They treated me well." "We need supervisors who understand both German and American methods," the officer said. "Are you interested in helping us rebuild this place?" Hans took the job, helping to design new factories for Munich. But these would not be factories for building weapons. These would be factories for building cars and radios and washing machines, things that made life better instead of destroying it. As he worked with American engineers, Hans began to understand something important. The same energy that America had used to build bombers and tanks could also be used to build schools and hospitals. The same abundance that had fed prisoners of war could also feed hungry children. "We want to help Germany become prosperous again," one American engineer told him. "We don't want you to stay defeated. We want you to become our partners." Partners. Hans thought about this word as he walked home through the rubble-filled streets. America had crushed Germany completely, but now they wanted to help rebuild it. They had won the war, but they were not interested in revenge. They wanted Germany to succeed. 6 months later, Hans was promoted to manager of a new factory that would build automobile parts. On his first day, he called a meeting of all the German workers. Many of them were former soldiers and prisoners like himself. All of them had lost the war and lost their illusions about German superiority. "I want to tell you something I learned in America," Hans said to the assembled workers. "We lost this war not because we were cowards or fools. We lost because we misunderstood what strength really means." The workers listened quietly as Hans continued. "We thought strength meant discipline and sacrifice and the willingness to suffer. We thought Americans were weak because they liked comfort and abundance. But I lived among them for 2 years. I saw their factories and ate their food and witnessed their incredible power to create instead of just destroy." Hans walked among the workers as he spoke. "They fed their prisoners better than we fed our own soldiers. They built more airplanes in 1 month than we built in 1 year. They did this not through cruelty or oppression, but through cooperation and efficiency and the belief that abundance is better than scarcity." One of the workers raised his hand. "What does this mean for us now?" Hans smiled. "It means we have a chance to learn from them. We can build factories that create prosperity instead of weapons. We can feed our families and still have enough left over to share with others.
We can become strong in a way that helps everyone instead of hurting our neighbors. Over the following years, Hans watched Germany slowly rise from the ruins. American aid helped rebuild the cities. American methods helped the factories become efficient. American ideas about democracy and prosperity took root in German soil. Hans never forgot the lessons he had learned in Camp Concordia. When his factory workers complained about working conditions, he reminded them of what he had seen in America. When politicians talked about making Germany great through military power, Hans spoke about the strength that comes from creating abundance. In 1955, Hans was invited to speak at a conference about German recovery. He stood before an audience of government officials and business leaders and told them about his experience as a prisoner of war. "I went to America as an enemy," Hans said. "I believed their democracy made them weak. I thought their love of comfort made them soft. But they defeated us so completely that they could afford to be generous to their enemies. They showed me that true strength is not about the ability to destroy, but about the capacity to create." Hans paused and looked at the faces in the audience. "They fed me better than my own country had fed me. They treated me with kindness when they could have chosen cruelty. They taught me that a nation's greatness is not measured by the fear it inspires, but by the abundance it can share." In that Kansas prison camp, I learned the most important lesson of the war. America did not defeat us because they were lucky or because they cheated. They defeated us because they understood something we did not. Real power comes from building up instead of tearing down. Real strength comes from creating prosperity for everyone, not just for the chosen few. Hans closed his speech with words that would stay with his audience forever. "Germany lost the war the day we decided that our strength came from making others weak. America won the war the day they decided their strength came from making everyone strong. That is the lesson I brought back from captivity. That is the gift America gave to a defeated enemy. And that is why Germany has a future worth building." As Hans walked home that evening through the rebuilt streets of Munich, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a proud factory supervisor building fighter planes, to a broken prisoner eating American chocolate, to a German businessman helping to rebuild his nation. Each step had taught him something new about what it meant to be truly strong. The chocolate bar in his canvas bag had long since been eaten, but the sweetness of American generosity still lingered in his memory, reminding him every day that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the simple act of showing enemies that there is a better way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.